the first thing you need to do to solve a problem is to really get a good definition of what's going on. So let's just go over a couple of tips to make that part better. Hello, I'm Tom. Welcome to my channel where we make operational excellence practical. And today we're going to be talking about how do you really get your problem definitions to a higher level. Well, for problem definition, you may know I use the 5 W's and 2 H's. So let's also just go for 7 tips, 1 for each. And let's dive into how can we make sure that we set our problem solving teams up for success by already starting at the basis. So just to first go over those 5 H's, 5 W's and 2 H's, it's a description, right? We want to know multiple aspects of the problem. We really want to get into the details, and we want to know what happened, where did that happen, when did it happen, which products are affected, who was working the process, who is involved, so to say, how does it actually present itself, so what sort of problem. This is more the how does the process lead up to it, and how much of our batches or how often is it repeating. So those fields, they all give us information about our problem. Now, as you may know, this should also be both the positive statements and the negative statements, and that isn't even our first tip. But so we pair this with an is and is not column when you go and download my template, for instance. Also, when you find it online, on most places they will do this split into positive and negative statements. But if you want that template, just follow the links in the description and the banner flying in at the moment. Now, what do these categories typically want us to describe? So the what category, that really is about, what is the problem? What do we see? What is the defect that is really happening? Right? We want to know what it is that we see. Now, the bonus tip here is to also dive into, so how do you spot it? What characteristics of the defect or the problem occurring or the deviation can we actually detect? So how do we detect it, right? How do we spot the problem? How do we, in practice, see that it's happening? This can give a lot of clues on top of, what do we see with a defect product, or what do we see in a deviation? Then where does it occur? Now, the info you definitely at least want to know is what line, what process, which area of a line. If we're talking a bit more mechanical, then, if it is a valve, I want to know exactly which valve. So I am very sure your maintenance department would love it if everybody on the maintenance orders would put things like, it's this valve number, it's this asset number for a part of the machine. I'd say that's so, almost any maintenance department will have a whole tree of asset numbers and locations, and they are based on a bit of a line and part, and then the specific part that it's targeted. If you could use that same language, they will love you for it. But now we're really talking about where on the line, where in the process. How about where on the product? And is that perhaps showing up in a specific pattern? So yes, definitely describe where on the line, where in the process, but also think about, is there something specific on where on the product do we see damage, or where in the service do we see the deviation? This is especially useful if we really are talking about more defects, right? But for instance, if you have an indentation in your piece of sheet metal, and it's always on the left side when rolling, and it repeats every meter, that gives you such big clues to what might be causing it, what's really happening there. So if you can specify where on the product things are happening, or maybe where in the service delivery, or where in more not the manufacturing process, but the usage process, and especially if we see certain patterns, brilliant information. Also here, for all of them, think about the is not part, right? So maybe you do see it always on the left, but never on the right, even though in your process they should be sort of equal, right? Stuff like that. Then when do we see it happen? Now the standard is, of course, just put a time there, right? Give it a, this was Wednesday 7:05 in the evening, and if it was a repeating thing, you put a couple of times there. But for the when part, the big tip is to not forget process timings. So is it right after a cleaning? Is it when you change material batches? Is it after something else happened, right? So after a setup, after a cleaning, after a material change, when the machine does a recalibration. Such things, right? They are not really fixed in a clock time. Of course, each instance will have a clock time connected to it, but there is a big clue if you see a similar problem reoccurring, and every time it is just after you switch a roll of materials. Stuff like that. It just immediately focuses you on, hey, something in this material change is affecting my process. It makes it much easier afterwards to go dive deeply into these process physics, these process mechanics. So if you, on the when part, can also link things to a moment in the process, absolutely do that. Now, which product is basically the standard question, right? So on which product do we see it, or in which service do we see it, and sort of also in which products don't we see it. Now you can just enumerate the products where you have seen it, but much stronger would be to do a check, right? Do we see it in certain groups or product families? So do we see similar products that have this defect or this problem versus do we see other product groups that never seem to have it? Now, the problem here is, of course, if you are reacting to one or two deviations, you don't really know where it doesn't happen, but at least it can help you to say in which product groups it did happen. That is, of course, way more useful if you have a problem that has been repeating a couple of times, right? So if you do this with the first deviation, you can't really make that distinction between, well, this product, yes, that product, no. The whole which product question sort of falls to the wayside when it is a single occurrence. But as soon as you have multiple reoccurrences of your problem, absolutely try to get which products it affects, so that into groups. So what types of characteristics does it seem to affect? Because that again points towards which process mechanics, what physical chemical things are maybe happening, or what organizational thing, right? A specific supplier for this group of products, just one part really comes from a specific supplier, stuff like that. You never know. So see if you can spot any groups in which products are affected. Then who? And again, what's the basic question? Who was the operator? And who made the mess? Be very careful with that question, by the way. But the standard things are, so who was the operator at the time? Does it always happen in shift A or also in B and C? Right? So is it maybe always around a shift? Maybe the who is always a non-trained person? How about we look a little bit broader? Because you see, the operator really isn't the only person affecting a process at any time. So who of the quality control department or team, who was the technician and the breakdown technician on shift, stuff like that. So who in a supporting role to this process was also active and on duty at that moment. Again, these could be teams, like a shift of technicians, but at the very least, this will give you the information of who else can I ask about what happened. The quality control engineer or a specialist or colleague, whoever, they will probably have specific info on how they sampled, what strange things maybe they have seen during that shift. The technician will have more info about how the lines were behaving. Were they maybe busy with some other breakdown so they didn't have attention for this? Stuff like that. Critical information if we're going to be diving into the problem. So it is for two main reasons. First off, the operator really isn't the only one affecting the process. So let's check if we see trends in the support functions. And also this way you know those other specialists around the time of the problem so that you can ask them extra questions. Then how? Now, with how, be very careful. Too often I see the advice that in how you basically make a root cause analysis. I hope you're not following that advice, right? I hope if you're a follower of this channel, I taught you well enough not to do that. Keep the root cause out of this. Direct cause, probably, even though I would relegate that to the fishbone analysis. But the how is a very direct, physical how. How do we see the process behave just before a problem? Did we maybe see sort of a run-up to this deviation? Did it start rattling just before it broke down? Did we see a reel of foil sort of getting wrapped up before the machine completely blocked? Stuff like that, right? So this is more sort of a, how do we see things happening? What can we identify as sort of direct things happening just before the deviation, just before the problem? Now, on that one, you also really want to keep on those physical things, so observable physical events. Don't go into any of the reasoning how it may have occurred. Don't go into diving into the root cause of how could we have allowed this part to deteriorate. That comes later. Stick to direct, physical, observable things, right? So that is what we want in a problem definition. That you go into a couple of likely candidates, maybe, as I said, I would rather do it in a fishbone, but definitely not deeper. Then how much? So again, first the classical thing, how much is, how much product did we have to block? How frequently does it happen? How many of time is it that we've seen this problem? And those are all very good questions and sort of triggering statements to trigger your thought. Think also about, put it into context, right? So that 1,000 kilos was blocked or affected. Is that a lot or not? In a factory that makes maybe 1,200 kilos a day, it's huge. In a factory that makes 100,000 kilos of that product a day, this is a percent. So what's the scaling? And for that, use percentages. And I'm not saying per se use the percentage as a 1 out of 100, but the idea is so to use those ratios, use a fraction, use a percentage. 1 in every 4 products is affected, gives you a different sort of information than 1,000 kilograms. Both are useful, but if you can place the amount of problems in relation to the amount of product produced, that gives you a lot more information afterwards to check for those trends and to check for how did that problem, did that deviation really occur. If you have things like it happens roughly in every 10th pallet and then it affects about half of the pallet, that is a very different situation from we see it in almost 100% of the pallets and it affects about 5% of each pallet. How much is the same, right? 1 in every 10, 50%? 1 in every 1, 5%? Percentage is the same, the amount is the same, but the distribution is different. So how does it affect how much of the throughout the production, how much of the productions, those kind of things. If you can use something like a percentage or like a divisor, like 1 in every 4, then you really give more information to the following stage of problem solving. Now that following stage goes much deeper into the how, because that following stage, well, we sort of, when we know all of this, we sort of, as a next step, do the temporary countermeasures, because when you know these details, they will become much more effective to put in place. But the real next step for this information is, of course, finding the causes. How did it happen? What direct physical events happened and were the cause of our deviation? And that will become much stronger with a broader view on these nice 7 information points, right? These 5 W's and 2 H's. So I hope that you liked these tips. I would love it if you would also sort of get inspired by this and share a couple of your own tips, because there's of course way more useful information to share about a good problem definition. Let's hit that comment field. Share, at least one nice tip, either specifically about one of these categories or just the problem definition in general. I would love to hear from you, and I'm also very sure that the other viewers of this channel would love to have some more input from your side as well. For now, I thank you for your attention, and I wish you the best of luck making really strong and detailed problem definitions. But also, don't forget to enjoy the continuous improvement journey.